Today, we're delighted to welcome Dan Treisman, who's a professor of political science at UCLA and a research associate at NBER. He's an expert on Russian politics and economics, as well as comparative political economy. And his books have ranged on topics from decentralization to corruption to Russia's autocratic system. He's been a fellow at the Guggenheim and Andrew Carnegie Foundation, as well as a visiting fellow at Hoover, the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, Casbah, and is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's the author of 6 extremely well-received books. Most recently, Spin Dictators just received an award, the Arthur Ross Award from the Council for Foreign Relations. And so we're delighted to welcome him today, as he'll speak on how great is the current danger to democracy. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Anna, for that very nice introduction. Thank you all for coming. So yes, my title today is Democracy in Danger? Assessing the Risk with Historical Data. And what I'm going to present is basically a slight update on a paper that already actually came out in Comparative Political Studies a few months ago. So if you want more details, I provide some there. So is democracy in danger? Well, if you picked up a newspaper or looked in the political science journals pretty much any time in the last 10 years, you will have seen a lot of warnings that things are not going so well these days in the political world. We read that democracy is in recession, it's in retreat, it's beleaguered, it's decaying. Around the world, fascism is on the march, according to one former Secretary of State. And within the US, American democracy is dying. American democracy is about to degenerate into some analog of the Nazi regime, according to Tim Snyder. And according to Masha Gessen, whose book is titled Surviving Autocracy, it's maybe even too late to preserve democracy. We have to learn how to live under it because, in her words, institutions will not save you. And a lot of recent books have reinforced this point. Okay, so I thought that given this very strong message, it might make sense to go back and look at some data and try and assess, based on the data we have, just what is the situation with regard to the security of democracy today. What do the historical data suggest? I mean, obviously, historical data tell us about history. They don't tell us about the future. But still, it may make sense to see what the patterns look like in the historical data and what the base rates are if we're going to try and make predictions. So I looked at the standards commonly used indicators of democracy: polity, Freedom House, VDEM, the lexical index of electoral democracy. All of these have issues. I could talk a lot about those, but any data set on something as complex and contested as democracy is going to have issues. But even though none of them is perfect, I wouldn't say it gets absolutely everything right. They tell a similar story in the end, which I think is worth taking seriously. So first question, is the proportion of democracies in the world decreasing? What do the data suggest? Well, if we look at polity, the answer seems to be no. The proportion of democracies in the world by the polity definition is at an all-time high. If we look at the lexical index of electoral democracies, which is a measure of countries that have more or less competitive elections for legislature and executive, again, it seems like there's still a kind of noisy upward trend. There's no very clear decline yet. With VDEM, measure of electoral and liberal democracies, putting them together, clearly there seems to be a plateau, and there's a lot of bumping up and down around that plateau. But again, I don't really see clear evidence of a decline in that data yet. There are two indexes, two measures that I found that do show a more definite deterioration in recent years. Those are the VDEM liberal democracy category. So this is from the regimes of the world variable, which categorizes countries into four types, from closed autocracy to electoral autocracy, electoral democracy, liberal democracy. So the proportion of liberal democracies, in their view, has gone down from about 24% to about 19%. And the Freedom House measure of the proportion of free countries, as opposed to partially free or not free countries, has also gone down a bit, from something like 47 to 43%. I'd make a few points about that data. First of all, if we look at the decline, according to the data, it takes us back to the 1990s, which, let's not forget, was a time when a lot of us were really rather bullish about democracy. There was a sense that democracy was triumphing around the world. There'd been this huge increase in democracies in the third wave. So if we've gone back, we've sort of gone back to not the worst moment in political history. Another question, though, is how solid are those numbers for VDEM liberal democracy and the Freedom House classifications. Now, both of those ratings downgraded a lot of countries in recent years. So between 2007 and 2021, both of them had quite a long list of countries that were downgraded from liberal democracy to electoral democracy, or not democratic at all, or from free states to partially free or not free at all. What do I notice in these lists? Well, first, there's almost no overlap. Hungary and Serbia appear in both. Sometimes, some of the countries that are downgraded in one rating are actually judged to be improving by the other raters. On the VDEM liberal democracy measure, it turns out that only 4 of the, 14 countries that VDEM judges to have deteriorated from liberal democracy to something less, only 4 of them dropped because of changes in specifically political institutions. The other 10 fell because of deteriorations, according to VDEM, on a few legal variables that VDEM added to the formula in 2018. These are transparency of legal enforcement and access to justice. And about both of those, I would say, maybe they belong in an index of democracy, maybe not. But in any case, they're pretty vague and they're pretty subjective. And sometimes when you look at countries that have been downgraded on legal transparency, for instance, and you look at the history of the country in that year, it's not easy to figure out why it was downgraded. And among those 10 that dropped because of reported deterioration in the legal environment, only 3 of those fell by an amount that was statistically significant. Okay, so perhaps the lesson from looking a little bit closer at these downgrades is that there's robust evidence, there's kind of general agreement on some countries that Hungary and Serbia have been backsliding. Maybe some others, like Poland and Mauritius, but for others, it's possible that they were backsliding, but the evidence really doesn't, to me, seem as clear. So far, I've been talking about categories and drops from a democratic category to a non-democratic or less democratic category. But what if we just look at the average level of democracy on a continuous scale, looking across all the countries in the world? So how has the average level of democracy, according to VDEM, changed in recent decades. So here are the VDEM indexes. Unfortunately, you can't see it very well because this shading on the graphs showing the confidence intervals. VDEM provides these confidence intervals, which aren't exactly based on statistical standard errors, but which VDEM thinks can be treated analogously, that they measure the degree of uncertainty. And the basic point is that between the end point and the peak on both of these graphs, the difference is not statistically significant, according to VDEM, according to their measures of uncertainty. Not even close to statistically significant. The error bands overlap to a great extent. Okay, are existing democracies breaking down at a faster rate than previously, right? Because the indexes or the aggregate measures might be quite constant or even going up because a lot of countries are improving, but still more than usual are deteriorating. Is that the case? Well, so if we look at the VDEM, if we look at the measures from all these different ratings, there isn't very much evidence of this, except in the case of VDEM liberal democracy, where there has been an increase, quite a clear increase in countries dropping from liberal to electoral democracy or not even democratic at all. But remember about this, this is exactly the set of countries that I just suggested, well, I just said were being downgraded in large part based on some somewhat subjective criteria of the legal system rather than anything specifically political. Okay, so my reading of these and other data, well, the number of democracies worldwide is actually still at or near an all-time high, maybe a little below, but close to an all-time high. Where indicators do suggest backsliding, it seems to be only to the level of the 1990s, when democracy was seen as triumphant. Of course, that doesn't mean it's a good thing if countries are backsliding, but it's worth recognizing the level as well as the change. Which countries lost democracy is not consistent across ratings. And often these downgrades seem to be based on subjective judgments about things like legal transparency. And most indicators suggest that the rate of breakdowns and deterioration are not particularly high compared to previous rates, although there does seem to be some recent trend towards illiberalism on the VDEM liberal democracy measure. Okay, so if that's at least my reading of the available data, what can we say from looking at these data about what correlates with breakdowns? And here, of course, I'm building on a substantial literature. Many other people have studied this. And it's very difficult to say something causal about what causes these breakdowns, but we can maybe say something about correlates, which is useful for predicting which may break down in the future. So, okay, I ran some regressions. Here are the results. Since those are a little hard to read, I'll tell you what basically it says. So I found that certain variables, again, this is very much in line with previous research. Some variables were robustly associated with higher odds of breakdowns of democracy. So if you have low income, a low growth rate, if you have little past history of democracy or a history of breakdowns of democracy, and if the state of global democracy doesn't look so good, if there are a lot of breakdowns occurring globally, and if the economic growth rates in democracies are low relative to the growth rates in authoritarian countries, all of that is associated with higher odds of breakdown. Some variables that are sometimes said to be important for breakdowns of democracy, I didn't find any robust relationship. Oil, gas income, having democratic neighbors, being in the post-Cold War era as opposed to earlier eras, inequality, having a presidential system. Okay, so if we take those robust correlates of breakdown, and well, if we want to use them, we want to know, first of all, how well do those robust factors predict breakdowns? Well, so based on some common standards in the literature on prediction, they do pretty well, especially predicting breakdowns of electoral democracy. So two criteria that are often used in evaluating models of prediction are the AUC ROC, response receiver operating characteristic, if I remember right, and the AUC PR, precision recall. The values one gets if one runs the model with those robust variables up to year t and then predicts for year t plus 1 are pretty high. They're, anything above 0.8 on the AUC ROC is considered good. Also, if we look at how many of the actual breakdowns were near the top of the list of predicted breakdowns, it turns out that 80% of the actual breakdowns were among the top 20 countries in estimated risk. So that compares quite well to even some machine learning models which have tried to do the same thing. Okay, and if we look at the cumulative breakdowns, so the blue line is the number of actual breakdowns since 2000, and the dotted red line is the number predicted by the model. So it's predicting about the right number of breakdowns. Okay, so if the model is reasonably good, can we use it to figure out how much backsliding we should expect, just given some characteristics of the new democracies? So in the third wave, a whole bunch of new countries became democratic. This is the period since the 70s, especially the 80s and the 90s. Two things about those countries. Well, first of all, they were a lot poorer than the average for democracies worldwide. So if we look at the median income of democracies, there's a sharp fall after 1989. So we have a lot of poorer democracies, and we saw from the model that poorer democracies are more likely to break down than richer ones. Also, obviously, all the new democracies are new. They don't have so much recent experience of democracy. And so the proportion of democracies that are new in this period goes up pretty sharply. So based on both of those, we should expect there to be a certain amount of backsliding, just because these new democracies have characteristics which make them more prone to backsliding. How much backsliding should we expect just based on that? Well, to see that, I ran models on data up to 1999, including just income levels or income and electoral democracy scores. So did they become very democratic, or had they just sort of edged across the line into democracy? And so I ran those models up to 1999. I then, for the subsequent period, I froze income and electoral democracy scores at the 2020 levels and predicted how high is the risk in each year for each country of breakdown based on just the data up till 2000 and the model up to 2000. So summing those hazards, we get an aggregate measure of how many breakdowns or what proportion of the democracies should we expect to break down just based on their income levels and their electoral democracy score as of 2000, as of the beginning of the period. And what we see is this is, again, the actual breakdowns, the number of actual breakdowns from electoral democracy. Based on just the lower income of the new democracies, we should expect that level of breakdowns. So a lot of it can be explained by just the fact that they were poorer. If one adds in the initial electoral democracy levels, so were they really democratic as of 2000, or were they just slightly democratic? That, together with income, ends up predicting, even slightly over-predicting, the level of breakdowns that we actually saw. So given the fact that most of the new democracies were, first of all, new, and secondly, poor, and these figures, I should say, take them as ballpark estimates. Of course, we can't claim any precision here, but it does suggest that a lot, or maybe all, of the deterioration that we saw, that the backsliding that we saw since 2000 could be expected based on the low income and the newness of those democracies. Okay, how high is the current risk of backsliding in the US? Okay, obviously this is a statistical exercise. It's not going to, again, I can't say anything with precision, but if we run the model based on the economic variables and the democratic history variables, what does it say about the risk of breakdown of democracy in the US year by year? What we get doing that with the VDEM measure of democracy is, and this is the both electoral and liberal democracy, we see that the model says there were actually, quite significant risks of backsliding from democracy during the Great Depression and World War II. It went up to maybe 1 in 10. But since then, as the US has become richer and as it's had more and more years of democracy, continuous democracy, the odds have fallen drastically to considerably less than 1%. And if we look at liberal democracy, during the global financial crisis, we see a slight increase, but still the odds are low, less than 1%, that the US would backslide from liberal democracy to electoral democracy. Okay, so this is just if the future turns out to be subject to the same patterns or governed by the same patterns as the past, that's what we should expect the risk of breakdown to look like. Okay, so that's what I have to say about the overall risks. There are various arguments about what causes backsliding. And of course, there have been some countries where backsliding is clear. So Hungary, I certainly wouldn't argue that it's still a perfect democracy if it ever was. So why do some countries slide backwards? Well, one very common argument is that it has to do with falling public support for democracy. As the general public becomes less supportive of democracy, that leads to backsliding by the people in power. And there's a very interesting article which provided really the first cross-national evidence that I've seen on this by Chris Klassen, which came out in 2020. What he does is he takes a whole bunch of opinion polls from 1988 on, and he combines them using a Bayesian model. And based on that measure of public opinion and the VDEM measure of liberal democracy, if I remember right, he finds that there does seem to be a relationship. So a fall in popular support for democracy on his measure leads to a fall in the VDEM liberal democracy index. So this was very interesting to me, so I looked at the data. Of course, that said, there are huge endogeneity issues. Even if there's a relationship, is it that opinion is causing political change? Is it that political change is causing change in opinion? We don't exactly know, but setting that aside, based on the data and the models that this article presents, which again, I find very interesting and quite compelling in some ways, can falling popular support for democracy explain backsliding in Western liberal democracies? Well, simple answer is no. Why? Well, because support for democracy in the data that Klassen gathered, support for democracy was actually rising in most cases in which backsliding was observed. So it wasn't that support for democracy was falling and that led to backsliding in institutions. support for democracy was actually rising. So this is just the average. The blue line is the VDEM measure, average liberal democracy score in the countries that were judged to be liberal democracies in 2000. And you see there's this decline. The dashed red line is the average level of popular support for democracy in Klassen's data. And we see that as the institutions are judged to be declining, popular support is actually increasing. And if we look at individual countries, especially the individual countries that are often singled out, Poland, again, we see that in the period where VDEM argues that there was a big decline in institutions, support for democracy was actually rising. Same with Hungary. And the US also, in the period where VDEM sees a decline in liberal democracy for the US, Klassen's data on approval of democracy or support for democracy was rising. So it doesn't seem to be the case. And in any case, if you run the same regressions that Klassen did, but you separate out the liberal democracies from the electoral democracies, it turns out that there's a relationship among the electoral democracies, but there isn't one for the liberal democracies. So really, this data that he collected doesn't provide any reason to think that a fall in support for democracy lies behind recent declines in liberal democracy. I know I'm running through a lot of stuff, but not too much more to go. Another important argument is that it all has to do with norms. So erosion of norms among elites in particular leads to decline in democracy. This kind of idea that democracy needs soft guardrails, sort of informal norms to keep it going. Again, it's a common argument. It's a very interesting argument. It's on the face of it, it's quite plausible. But is there any evidence? The only study I could find of this that actually came up with empirical measures to test it is from a great book by Scott Mainwaring and Annabelle Perez-Lignan on Latin America. And what they do is they look at the countries from 1945 to 2005. They come up with measures of who, or categorizations of who were the main political actors in each period. They classify what the norms of those actors were. Were they basically supportive of democracy or not? How radical were they on policy, on economic policy, and so on? And they find that elite actors' commitment to democracy correlates negatively with breakdown, which is, I would say, very much the conventional wisdom, very much what we would expect to find. But if you look a little closer at the data and the regressions, I find that this is driven by Argentina and Uruguay. So if you take out Argentina and Uruguay, there's no relationship between the norms and democratic survival in the other 18 countries. And then if you look at how democracy broke down in Argentina and Uruguay, it's interesting because in 4 of the 5 breakdowns, which are basically driving this result, what happened was there was a radical pro-dictatorship military which overthrew civilian leaders in a coup. So I think the moral of this study is that pro-dictatorship militaries are dangerous to democracy. And I certainly am not going to argue with that. It seems like a very, very useful and believable message. But I'm not sure how far we can extend that to infer things about the erosion of norms of sportsmanship in the US Congress and so on. Okay. So this is a lot of provocative stuff that I'm throwing at you, and I'm sure there's going to be some doubt and some pushback. So let me just state the conclusions, and then we can get to all the critiques. So it seems to me that based on the data available to us, and it could change in a few years, I don't know the future, I definitely recognize that, but at present, the proportion of democracies in the world is still at or near an all-time high. if there's backsliding, it's so far just to the level of the 1990s, which was experienced as a period in which democracy seemed to be triumphing. Momentum has clearly slowed or stopped, but that comes after an incredible surge in the third wave, an incredible increase in the proportion of democracies. Democratic breakdowns, whether by coup or backsliding, are much less likely at high income levels in countries that aren't in an economic depression, and when countries have a long history of democracy. The extent of backsliding since 2000 on the VDEM electoral democracy measure is consistent with the lower income and the newness of these third wave democracies. Falling public support for democracy does not explain backsliding in liberal democracies, at least based on the best data we have from Klassen, because support for democracy in the liberal democracies has generally been rising in the countries where there was backsliding. This might nevertheless be part of the explanation in some electoral democracies. Some electoral democracies, not all, but in some, there was a decline in support for democracy at the same time as a perceived drop in the level of democracy. I couldn't find any evidence that, or I couldn't find much evidence that weak elite norms lead to democratic breakdown, unless, that is, the army is radical, interventionist, and anti-democratic. In that situation, the norms of the army certainly matter. It could be that eroding norms undermine democracy, but so far, I haven't seen any clear cross-national evidence. Based on the US income level, our long democratic experience, and the absence of a Great Depression, at least at present, odds of democratic breakdown seem to be extremely low. Of course, that's based on the past. The future could be different. Of course, that's possible. I think erosion in quality of democracy is much more plausible. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying be complacent. We need to monitor very closely, and we need to act to support democracy. Of course, that's important, whether or not the threat is apocalyptic or less severe. But I don't yet see evidence to justify extreme alarm. I worry less about a wave of democratic breakdowns and more about chaos and unfairness at the margin. That's what I particularly worry about in the US. Unfair elections, sporadic violence, increasing, not declining support of democracy, but an increasing feeling that the government is not acting democratically. So I do worry about those things, but I think we need to be clear and distinguish that kind of deterioration of quality from breakdown of democracy as it occurred, for instance, in Chile in 1973, because the kind of policies and approaches needed to deal with these two problems, I think, is rather different. I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
All right, since this is a joint seminar, I guess the division of responsibility this time is that I handle questions. So if you just sort of flinch or move a muscle or somehow catch my eye, I will add you to the list. Larry Diamond, what a surprise. Okay, all right, Amikai, I'm going to, as I make my list, also, Dan, ask you a question about, really, first, super interesting, and if you're right, and I hope you are, kind of encouraging, but there is a kind of in the long-term aspect to the argument, and you sort of step back from the immediate term and the possibility of black swan events in your conclusions here. One question I had as I was looking at your graph of the Klassen data was, could the increase in popular support for democracy rise as the VDEM measures go down? Could this be a response? I mean, you've probably thought about this, right? I mean, so there's some sort of interactive effect and possibly even a lag.
Yes, I think that's a very plausible interpretation of it, that it's when things go bad in politics in a visible way that people realize that it matters to them. And so they express more forcefully that they support democracy. It's when it's challenged that we see the public, first of all, tuning in and then expressing support. That's my interpretation. I don't necessarily have evidence to prove that.
Okay, interesting. Larry?
So thank you very much, Dan. Incredibly rich and fascinating presentation.
But
I have a lot of comments, but I'll just note two and then probably wind up sharing the rest in an email. On the measurement side, I think we need to distinguish two things. First of all, I think the distinction between electoral and liberal democracy is very important and also very valuable in your analysis. For me, an electoral democracy is simply one where the people can choose and replace their leaders in free and fair elections, which I think is no longer the case in Hungary, even though, by the way, Freedom House still counts Hungary as an electoral democracy.
VDEM doesn't.
Yeah. But I think we also need to distinguish between size of country, because if we're looking at what's happening in the world, Mauritius and India are not equal in terms of their influence in the world, even though both are trending in a significantly negative direction. And if you take the countries that are really consequential, say have more than 50 million people or more than $500 billion in gross domestic product or both, it's not even close. I can share the data with you.
It's in my paper.
Oh, okay. I haven't seen the paper, but it's overwhelmingly weighted towards regression.
That's right.
And I don't know if your numbers are looking at all countries or only ones over 1 million population, but the ones under 1 million population also kind of distort the picture because they're so overwhelmingly democratic and liberal. In any case, so I'm very worried about what's happening in bigger countries like India, Indonesia, Mexico, the Philippines, and so on, where I think the trends have been overwhelmingly negative. And as you probably know, there's a big debate now about whether we can even call India a democracy anymore. On the elite norms question, and I'll close with this, if you're looking at sudden breakdowns, essentially military coups, or a Kais Saied declaring an autogolpe or Fujimori or something, then we can have that debate. But if you're looking at the other way that democracy disappears by gradual suffocation, so that, Orban and Erdogan, there's no declaration of emergency, they just gradually drag the conditions of democracy down below a minimum threshold. That's all elite norms. I don't see how else you can explain it. You have ruling elites that are violating constitutional norms, strangling democratic pluralism, independence of the media, and so on. And it reaches a point where democracy doesn't exist anymore. So in one scenario of democratic breakdown, I haven't done the analysis, and I can see how it might go either way, though I still take Juan Lintz's work on elite norms very seriously. But in the other, I don't see any other, obviously there are other things going on, but I think the change in elite norms and behavior, you can't simply understand the disappearance of democracy without that.
Okay, great questions. First, on size. And I mean, the VDEM people make this argument very strongly. I've argued with them about it, although we don't necessarily disagree. So VDEM has lately been really emphasizing that measures should be population weighted. I think it depends what question you're asking. So if your question is, how has the situation of the average citizen in the world changed? Then it makes sense to weight by population, right? Obviously, India, there are more people in India than in the Seychelles. If, as I think I am, you're trying to understand trends in political systems and trends in the world, then it's not clear that you really want to be population weighting. In a sense, every country is a case. Now, they are interdependent, and you need to model that, or you need to think about that. And I understand the argument that we should pay more attention to the influential countries that are more likely to affect others. And I think that's true. But in simply measuring the effect, measuring what's happening, and in trying to understand the causes of what's happening, I don't see a very strong argument for weighting by size. So I think it depends on the question you're asking. On the elite norms, clearly elite norms, well, okay, first of all, let's define elite norms. Second, let's do some research and figure out how to measure that in practice, and then see whether there's a change in elite norms before you get backsliding, as in Hungary, or not. It seems to me that very often what we think of as elite norms are highly endogenous. So you have a leader like Orban who decides he's going to change things, and he either persuades people around him or he picks people and promotes them who will go along with his plans. So yes, in the end, you end up with a lot of opportunists and cynics running things. But I'm not sure it was caused by a change in elite norms. It seems to me it came down to more to Orban's decisions and the situation that constrained or failed to constrain him. So I would look to things like institutions and the structure of society, all the sort of basic things like civil society and so on. What I'm not so convinced by is these arguments that if we see that people in Congress are behaving badly, elbowing each other in the back and refusing to pass bipartisan legislation, that necessarily implies that we're on a slide to real deterioration of democracy. There are worse things which are more threatening, but again, I think there are also a lot of constraints on how far, things like trying to overturn elections through specious arguments are able to go at the moment. So that's what I'd say. I mean, it's really hard to study this. I would like to see clear empirical evidence that elite norms measured in some plausible way changed before backsliding in democracy, to believe that there's really, or even to think that there's really a causal relationship there.
It's very hard to do because the main way we measure elite norms is by inferring them from behavior, and that's the problem.
Yeah, totally agree.
Okay, next on our longish list is Amikai. And if everyone could introduce themselves, Dan will know most of you, but not all of you necessarily. So.
Thanks so much. Really fascinating. I'm again visiting professor here at FSI. The figures that you showed were sort of global aggregates, but I'm wondering whether you saw a meaningful regional variation. So once we control for levels of income and the longevity of democracy, do you see significant differences in rates of breakdown between Europe, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, or other parts of the world? And if so, what might account for that? I was very struck, secondly, by this kind of paradoxical relationship that you saw as democracy becomes more contested, levels of support for democracy rise. But I do want to point out some survey data that I've collected with a couple of colleagues over the last few months show that is true in Israel. But at the same time, levels of support for strongman rule also increase, and levels of support for use of political violence to defend democracy also increase. So you have all these kind of cross-cutting dynamics, some of them supporting democracies, some of them undermining democracies. Do you have any thoughts on that? I have a big history question for you, but in the interest of time, we'll leave that for you guys.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Yeah, on this question about what happens when to public opinion as political institutions deteriorate, it seems to be very plausible that it polarizes things, right? So you get some who rally to defend democracy, and you perhaps get others who think, no, we really need a strong man. What's interesting in the US context is the people who really want a strongman often say that they're defending democracy.
Right.
So
Both sides are defending democracy.
and I think genuinely believe it, which makes it very complicated. And I don't have a good answer or analysis of that, but I think it's very interesting. And so I very much agree with what you're finding, or it seems to be very plausible what you're finding on regional patterns. I should look closer. I mean, what shocked people, I think, is that you've seen backsliding in Eastern Europe. Clearly, there's been a lot of potential or real cases in Eastern Europe. Latin America, Larry may know this, have looked at this data more recently and may be able to answer this better than me. I think Latin America is kind of mixed. There are definitely cases. Yeah, I would have to look to give you a better answer than that.
Okay, great. Thanks. Dee.
Hi, I'm Dee from CDRL. So I guess I have questions about implications for the study of comparative politics and implications for how we communicate to the public. So a lot of the variables you use seem to strike me as, from the transitology era, like structural variables that try to help us understand if democracies will consolidate or not, except now you're applying them to see if they'll backslide or break down. That's a pretty rigid, just, kind of binary dichotomy between democracies and autocracies that is 30 years old. And I just wonder if you disaggregate democracy, if you think we would see more variation. And also, do you think that structure just always trumps agency? Is that sort of the conclusion? And then the question for how we communicate with the public, I understand that precision is really important, but a lot of the books that you cite at the top are trying to sort of make people aware of what democracy means and what are the ways that we can look out for, try to match our sentiment and feelings about not liking the politics that we're living in to what actually could happen. And they draw on a lot of historical examples of how that's happened, but I don't think it's necessarily just hysterical. So what do you think are better ways to message if we want to be more nuanced, or what do you think are the implications of what you sort of described as hysteria?
Thanks. I guess 3 great questions. First of all, on disaggregating democracy, yes, I'm all in favor of that. So yeah, this is disaggregating liberal electoral. That doesn't take you very far. In the big project that I've been trying to make progress with over the last few years, I've been disaggregating democracy into multiple institutional elements which emerged at different times in history in the West, and trying to understand the process by which each of these things emerged. So starting with the representative legislature, government responsibility, broad suffrage for men, for women, free and fair elections. Yeah, and I've actually been using your work to do that in part. So yes, I think that is an important direction that it makes sense to go in, to try and disaggregate more, to stop talking about what happens in democracy when it's at this sort of vague aggregate index, rather than trying to see, well, is there a difference between what causes a decline in free and fairness of elections and, say, a coup which removes executive responsibility or these other things that can happen. There may be different causes. Definitely, there were different battles in getting these different things introduced in different places. On structure and agency, no, I don't think structure always. I don't think it's even the right way to think about it in terms of which dominates, because I think the mental image I have of this is that you have these structural factors which create predispositions towards a certain kind of regime, but you don't necessarily get change until something happens in the world of agency. Some triggering event, or which I think turnover of leaders is one big trigger, but it could be other things. Other people have suggested that economic crises trigger these changes, which are kind of foreshadowed or prepared, in a sense, by the structural factors. So I think as countries get more economically developed, they're more likely to transition to democracy, and they're more likely to sustain democracy. But it doesn't mean that at a certain threshold income level, poof, they automatically change. No, you need something to happen in the agency and the political process, which undermines the dictatorship who's got things under control, let's say. And finally, communication. The literature on global warming suggests that scaring people isn't a good idea, that fear demobilizes them. People despair, they go into denial, they just give up. The emotions that mobilize people are hope, anger, and to some extent anxiety, which motivates people to seek more information. So I think a better messaging strategy would be not to make these not to talk in these grand terms about democracy collapsing, not to make comparisons between the US today and Chile in 1973 or Germany in 1932, because I don't think those are good comparisons to begin with, and they make people feel hopeless. I think we want to, if I were to talk to policy people, I would, and they know this, I think, I would suggest focusing on things like running for school board, analyzing a particular situation and thinking, how can we make it better through concrete steps, through participating in particular ways. So I think very pragmatic and focus on unfairness. Like, it's just not fair if the other side steals this election, rather than focusing on democracy is collapsing, we're going to be Nazi Germany. Because, yeah, people, I don't think really buy that.
Okay, great. All right, turning back to my list. I have Anat, I have Steve Stedman, I have Jonathan. So let me know if I've missed somebody. Okay, Anat.
Hi, my name is Anat Mati. I'm from the business school. I want to turn, I loved your book, Spin Dictators, and my observations have to do with spin, CEOs. In other words, with confusing the public about all kinds of things, with merchants of doubt, with big myths about our choices, about communists and capitalists, that kind of thing. And they're sort of very subtle, but broader ways of taking over legal systems that are really confusing to the public. And so it doesn't feel like, the sort of stuff is collapsing would resonate. What's actually going on is actually quite dangerous. So I think, so these are quality measures that are really happening, and I've seen them and we can discuss. That's more like code of capital, restore, and a lot more than that. And they lead to public anger that has legitimacy, but that is unfocused.
Well, that seems to me very believable. And I think we need to find ways to study these subtle things. I mean, Harry's thought a lot about backsliding and the different elements and how one can study that. And the kind of manipulation through public messaging, people have been studying that for decades, but it does feel that there are some aspects of it in democracies and definitely in authoritarian states that we still need to understand better. So,
I have just one quick quote that that I would say is, well, never mind.
Okay, Steve Stedman, then Jonathan, and Dincha has just been added to the list.
This is great. Can you put your concluding slide back up there just for a sec?
It might not be within his.
Oh, it might not be. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was on the United States where it was very succinct. There's really no risk of democratic breakdown, but what we will see is kind of major erosion in quality of democracy. But I think this is a variant of Didi's question, structure and agency, but it has to do with one big event, something called a breakdown, and a whole bunch of little events, which is erosion of that is democratic quality. So in your world, is there no relationship between erosion of democratic quality and democratic breakdown? Is it pretty much infinite? You can go in terms of bad quality. At what point does bad quality actually, or does it not trigger breakdown? I mean, that's the kind of those two things.
Well, kind of the simple answer in terms of measurement is VDEM has these continuous scales and it also has these categories, thresholds. And so, yeah, continuous deterioration can put you across a threshold according to VDEM. And that's much more what we've been seeing rather than these big jumps to a lower level, which were more frequent in the past through coups and dramatic breakdowns. So yes, no, I'm very worried about that backsliding. In the data that we have to date, that backsliding, I mean, it's been offset to some extent by improvements in other countries. I mean, if we just look at the
I was just thinking about the US case.
In the US case, yeah, in the US case, I'm very worried about all those things. I would characterize them as attempts to cheat within the system, to steal elections, to bias the electoral machinery in favor of one party, to undermine the authority of the legislature. So I totally agree with a lot of the discourse on what's wrong with the US. I just resist calling that breakdown of democracy because I don't see the US changing to some other kind of system. I think it's going to remain, what do I know? But my guess is it's going to remain basically democratic. There'll be elections. The elections will be less free. And maybe we will cross a threshold eventually where the elections are so unfree that we agree it's no longer a democracy. But that doesn't happen often for countries that are as economically developed and as have had such a lot of, so much history of democracy as the US has. So it would be quite surprising. It would be an exception to the historical patterns.
Yeah, so I just follow. So I started working on this about 12 years ago. I ran a global commission on how to promote and protect the integrity of elections. And my boss at the time, Kofi Annan, was very concerned with how often elections in Africa in particular become one-shot games. You know, they're not iterated games where if you lose, you feel like you can come back and contest. And so what happens is if you lose, you try to extort power, right? Extort power sharing, or you just deny the election results, all this stuff. But we were looking worldwide, and you start looking at what are the guardrails in the United States on elections. It turns out none of what we do is best practice, right? We don't have professional election management. We really don't have caps on campaign spending. Apportionment is led to legislator. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff here that's not best practice worldwide. But it was American exceptionalism. Well, America can have really bad election practices because somehow we are exceptional. We're very rich. Okay, we have a long history of democracy. And the things that you were seeing over the last 4 years are very much looking like the problems of a new democracy where elites are trying to figure out, is there going to be an iterated game? If I lose, what happens, right? That's why I think maybe I'm more worried about the quality of the electoral norms and so forth.
Right.
Yeah.
Let me answer that just very quickly. If you look at the details of the backsliding in places like Hungary, obviously Russia, Turkey, many others, it just doesn't look like what's happening in the US in some important ways. The constitutions in those countries were easy to change. The constitution in the US is really hard to change. And that was crucial for Orban, for Chavez in Venezuela, for Erdogan. It made things a lot easier for them. Putin changed the constitution, but he didn't need to. Yeah, it wasn't gonna happen. Even though there were similarities. So there are, yes, we see what the Republicans are doing resembles some things which have happened in the backsliding countries. So we jump too quickly to think, oh, well, it's purely comparable. We should be just as scared. We forget that there are a lot of other things which are a bit different.
Okay, I think next in line, oh, Jonathan, right next to me. Yep.
I just, I guess this can be kind of quick because maybe we've already hit on this a couple of times, but it just seems to me that that if there's tension between you and Larry, it mainly has to do perhaps with your adoption of a sort of a Jaworski-like binary approach, because the idea is we want to have a binary indicator so we can do transition probabilities. And I totally understand why that makes sense. But if we have this continuous approach to the measurement of this thing, then the kind of story that where there's things happening just above the threshold, and we haven't quite gotten to the threshold yet. And you're saying, well, eventually we will, and then we'll have this big transit, then we'll see it. But like if Larry is taking this more kind of continuous approach, then he's going to come up with a different story. And it's the one at the end you say, well, I am concerned about quality of democracy. So you would call it quality, and maybe Larry would just call it democracy, as a continuous variable. And are you really maybe saying the same thing? I'm just trying
Can
to.
I just add a coda that is only partially true, because I think if you look at the countries with populations over 1 million population, the percentage of democracies in that among
Even if it's
150
binary,
plus
yeah.
countries has fallen from a peak of 57% in 2006 to 43 to 45% today. That's not catastrophe. I wouldn't even call it a third reverse wave, but it's a pretty significant decline by my measure.
Yeah, so over 1 million people. Yeah, I'll think about that.
Wait, is that number of countries, the 47 cities,
Percentage
or
of
people living under
No,
democracy?
it's states. It's not
So
population.
it's not
Yeah,
population.
yeah, I got that. Yeah, maybe I need to think about that. Maybe I should
I'll
change my
send you
mind.
the data.
Okay. On the continuous thing, I don't think that's the issue, because I showed the average level of electoral democracy and the average level of liberal democracy, according to VDEM. Those are continuous measures. And the point there was that there has been a little decrease in both of those, but it's within the confidence interval. It's not close to statistically significant.
Okay, I guess yeah, there were a lot of things moving quickly. I was thinking those were average. I was thinking that was something else. So those were just averages of the
So
continuous.
I've looked at both continuous and categories, separate categories, and I don't see the data on that. I also looked at whether, so another thing that could be happening, which sort of hinted at, or even said, was countries could be getting close to the lower bound, but not crossing the threshold. So is that happening a lot? I looked at that. I looked at what's the trend in the average level of democracy on the continuous measure within a category. So all those that are classed as liberal democracies, have they started to bunch at the bottom more than before? And the answer is no. There's not much sign of that. So it's not like they haven't crossed the threshold yet, but they're bunching right before that.
Okay, so the real difference is just population weighting, and
It
that's
seems like it's this 1 million and population weighting.
And also, I'll just say, the number of countries, India is an example. What do we call them today?
Yeah.
Is India a democracy? You can make the case either way. And so if you're trying to say, what is the extent of erosion of democracy of countries sliding below that threshold? We don't have agreement among the ratings agencies.
Yeah.
You showed that, I thought, very effectively among academics.
But now I'm going to turn to Dinsha, who works on India, to resolve that for us quickly. Dinsha?
Larry and I are working on a book together on India. I'm at Hoover and at FSI. Actually, I'm going to ask a different question about what's happening with authoritarian consolidation, because it could be that they're just, if you're sort of a weak authoritarian government that might become potentially democratic in the next 5-10 years, it's very different than if you.
Can you speak up just a bit? I'm seeing signaling in the
Sure,
back.
sorry. I'm asking about authoritarian consolidation, whether we're seeing more of that. This is tangential to your project, of course, but if the stock of countries that could potentially become democracies, if that's reducing, that's something that could also slow down what we're seeing.
Right. That's complicated, because I think in recent years, very recent years, well, we can all think of cases of authoritarian consolidation, China, Russia, and various others. if we look at the longer period, this gets to my work on spin dictators, what we call spin dictators. What we find is that if you look since, well, at least since 1980, there's been a big decrease in the use of mass violence by dictatorships. There's been an increase in pretending to be democratic among dictatorships. There's been an increase in using manipulation rather than sort of blatant, obvious, intimidation, repression, or election rigging. So they've tried, people have increasingly tried to keep the elections looking, maybe not clean, but a little bit more credible than definitely at the height of the Cold War. So fewer 99% victories, more 75% victories. So in that sense, I would say there's been a trend towards more deceptive, softer methods used by authoritarians, but it could be reversing. And definitely we've seen Putin in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey, and Venezuela, with the change from Chavez to Maduro, moving backwards from this kind of more media savvy, manipulative, deceptive style of dictatorship to a more overtly violent, repressive type.
All right, and so we
Save the last question for Anna, hiding out in the corner here. Oh, you're kind of hiding. Hit him with a hard one. Go ahead.
So Dan, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. And just picking up on what Amichai and Dee said earlier. So if it's not public support, and if it's not elite short of dictatorial militaries, what accounts for the backsliding insofar as there's backsliding?
So what accounts for the backsliding? Well, I mean, my simple, too easy answer is it's the lower economic development. Yeah, but you see a lot of countries crossing the threshold during the third wave, and this doesn't account for all cases, but a lot of them, they cross the threshold, but they're relatively low levels of economic development. There's not very strong social support. There aren't strong institutions, civil society to defend against backsliding. And they have very little democratic experience. And so, a shock comes along and they go backwards. I mean, I could throw in other factors like China in Africa, providing aid without any strings attached or without the same kind of strings attached. That may have played a part in Africa. But I think, the most convincing general answer is that there were just a lot of really weak democracies that appeared, and therefore we see a higher rate, although I would say we don't see much of a higher rate, but in those cases, often the explanation is that there are exceptions like Hungary, which is quite a economically developed country. It had quite a lot of democratic experience, but still not that much.
All right, great. Oh, okay, Brett, in way back. Yes, yep. For a long one. Yep.
Right.
So this is just a kind of follow up on Anna's question. So it seems to me, you didn't quite say this, but sort of, my interpretation of the core argument is that the world kind of over democratized, right, between say 95 and 2015 or so. And so what we're sort of really witnessing is sort of just a reversion to what we would have expected otherwise, right? Which is sort of how you get the projection and the actual converging. So then the question, in some sense, this is like maybe this is sort of like a more optimistic view of things, but there's also sort of a pessimistic spin to it. In that, it was sort of always going to happen anyway, right? Which is, I think, sort of one of the things that you got in your response to. And so I'm just curious, kind of broadly, like if we should the world have done something differently, right? Was it really always fated to be this way, or was there something sort of like in terms of our kind of international agency that could have sort of helped fashion a different outcome? And insofar as a new geopolitical competition is underway, maybe we'll end at some point in a decade or two. How should we think about what's better to do in the future, kind of the next time there's kind of this like window for an expanded kind of democratization to emerge? That may be a long question, but
No, that's a good question. But okay, so the sort of variables that I can study and that I see mattering are not things which are easily manipulated by policy, right? So economic development, we don't have a great record. We don't really know how to stimulate economic development in other countries, in my view. The international setting matters. And so I think you see in the regressions, and there's lots of other evidence that having a global society which was more attuned towards supporting democracy worldwide after the end of the Cold War made a difference. And maybe that's weakened. Clearly, with the rise of authoritarian powers like China and the more aggressive stance of Russia, there are now a lot of forces pushing against that. And so I could say, yes, we ought to be doing more to get Wagner out of Africa and try and support institutions like the African Union, the Organization of American States, and to encourage them to really stick to their policies of not recognizing countries when the regime changes through coup, that sort of thing. But it's easy to say that when there are changes in the balance of power in the world, there isn't that much we can do about that. So not a very good answer. I think there are obviously things at the margin, and there are obvious cases of hypocrisy where the West has, for instance, coddled Rwanda under Kagame and Museveni too, where just specific policies could have been different. But in the big picture, how important are those policy mistakes? Hard to say.
Great. Well, thank you, Dan, very much. Thank all of you for your great questions. And that's it. We can adjourn. Thanks again.